All right, welcome to the Meteor Club Q&A, everyone. So this month, I think we have an extra special guest with us, Matt from MDG. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Hey, Josh, how's it going?
Good, good.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited to have you on here. I think,
Excited to
I
be
think,
here.
yeah, I think maybe we'll have some tougher questions than we normally get. I don't know.
Wait, this isn't a quiz, is it?
No.
Okay.
But you can make up the answers, right? There's no right or wrong answer. Yeah. So it looks like we've got 198 people registered, and if you haven't seen this show before, it saves onto YouTube, and I've got a playlist over there, so you can go to my YouTube channel and find the Meteor Club Q&A. And just once a month, I have a guest on, and we talk about all things Meteor and take live questions and that kind of thing. So, yeah. So I think a lot of the questions seem to center around either Galaxy or SQL or when's the roadmap going to be updated. So maybe start thinking that way. I'm kind of curious. I didn't see this question in here, so I'll just ask, like, how are you guys feeling and thinking about React and Angular and that kind of thing?
Oh, interesting place to start. Yeah, and all this stuff ties together. So
Sure.
maybe we can hop around a little bit.
Yeah.
And I should, well, let's just jump into it. Yeah, so we're really interested in this stuff. And the reason, besides the obvious, just that there's been so much interest in React, if you look at what people are talking about on Hacker News, and Angular, if you look at the number of developers, the number of apps being written, the number of questions on Stack Overflow, things like that, are both getting a lot of attention. So the way we look at this, let's take a step back, is just how fast JavaScript alone has risen. And I think back to 2012 when we first announced Meteor, and that was still a time when the people thinking really on the edge were building apps in JavaScript. Certainly if you were delivering a first-class product out of a company like Google or Facebook or Quora or whatnot, you were immersed in this idea that you could write a lot of the front end of your app in JavaScript. And you would do it because it gave you this really great desktop-like experience. It gave you better collaboration. It gave you more of an engaging multi-user user experience, right? And that, for a lot of those companies, defined the product. I mean, another example, maybe more recently, is Uber, where the whole idea of seeing in real time where the different cars are, or for a driver to be able to respond in real time to accept a fare, those are things that don't make any sense unless your application is built in this new style, this new engaging, some people call it real-time or reactive style. So that was pretty bleeding edge back in 2012, 2013, as we started building the first version of Meteor. But what we found now is, of course, everybody's writing in JavaScript. And we see it in the enterprise when we talk to large companies. They're trying to understand, how do I get my apps onto mobile, onto tablets? Why is it that the apps I use in my company are really old and slow, and then I go home and the apps we use on the internet or my kids use on the internet seem really amazing and advanced? That's kind of a weird state of history. So the way we think about this is we're building a JavaScript application platform, right? The language has gotten really popular, and it's exciting that now it's, I think, accepted among many developers that the best way to build the front end of your application is to use JavaScript. It's certainly the language that runs in the most places, so you can have a single code base that lets you have a application on your web browser, on your tablet, on your phone. It's also the code base you could use to run your cloud backend, right? So it's got this property that no other language has about running in all these different places that your app would run. It's also got this great ecosystem now of components, of everything from Bootstrap and jQuery plugins and Ionic, and I mean, just the list goes on and on of all these different higher level elements that we can bring into an application as we're writing, or the tools behind those things. So Sass and Stylus and Less, right? The idea that you can really start to build a library of presentation layer technology and things built against that you can use very quickly. The problem is it's a total mess, right? It's a fragmented ecosystem. So the rise of one technology like React happens in parallel with another very different technology like Angular. We've got Node, which is now forked into different versions. We've got all throughout the stack. On the one hand, we have this amazing collection of really great stuff. And on the other hand, what we don't have is a platform, right? A way to use all that, or the best parts of it, or a good combination of some of them at least, in a reasonable, repeatable way. So here's some examples of what you don't get without a platform. You can't take one team of developers that's built an application and hand that application to another team of developers, because they don't necessarily agree on which tools they used, which systems or libraries are in there, how they're connected, what are the conventions around how that code is written. And that's everything from like coding style to how do we use, class-like things in JavaScript to where our files are arranged and so forth. You don't have that transferable knowledge that any Rails developer has if they walk into a Rails shop, right? They can look at a Rails project and immediately get a map of how that application's set up. Another example is on the more technical side, you don't have a wire protocol. So any Rails app speaks REST. So I can connect to it from any other REST system. I don't have to agree with the backend team on exactly how I built that, right? Whereas in the JavaScript world, when we build one of these really rich interactive apps, typically the connections between the different parts, the piece that runs on the phone versus the piece that runs in the cloud, that's completely made up by each team as they go. And maybe it's based on WebSockets, or maybe it's based on long polling, but we don't have all these interoperable tools. So we don't have proxy servers, we don't have something like curl, we don't have something like Apache Bench. And there again, you end up with this really fragmented world where something one team built doesn't particularly well integrate with anything that another team built, even in the same organization. So just to give you a sense of what we're thinking, the way we want to tie all this together is the idea of an application platform. So our job in some sense is to collect the best parts of that rich ecosystem that's emerged. And a lot of it's emerged since we started building Meteor, which gets to your point about React, for example. And bring those into a really well-maintained a system that has, one way to think about it is one book you can read that lets you build the whole app using your basic JavaScript skills and your basic HTML skills. So, the way we think about React is some really interesting stuff has emerged in the last couple of years. One of them is the work that Facebook's done on reactive DOM, and we're really excited about it. So probably some of you have seen we have a project in the works, and this will be part of the next Meteor release of offering a choice of view layers. So if you want to use React as a view layer, people are already doing that, of course, but we want to make that something that's well supported, something that's very easy to use out of the box, as a complement to the template-based system that we ship with Blaze. So you have your choice. If you want to build JSX and React components, that's great. If you want to build Blaze components, that's great too. And in fact, they all fit together. So we have an example that we've been fooling around with where we use both. We embed a React component into a Blaze template, right? And
nice.
This stuff is like, I think really exciting, mostly because there's so much out there that developers can take advantage of. And what we want to do is make the patterns behind that stuff really clear and easy to understand. So there's probably a dozen different ways that people have bolted reactivity onto a Meteor React application, right? How do you exchange data between a React component and live data in Meteor? We've tried to figure out what is the best API for doing that, what's a standard API for doing that, so now anybody who wants to use React in a Meteor application doesn't have to spend a day thinking through that particular detail, and they can get right to the business of writing the app.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's interesting too, because if you watch your hires, like you guys hired Yuri, and he's actually going to be on a future episode of the Meteor Club podcast where we talked about a lot of this stuff.
Right on. Yeah.
Yeah,
and I said all that about React, but the same thing's true for Angular, and we're really interested in Angular as a new layer as well. Especially in the enterprise, you see massive adoption of Angular. It's emerged as a very popular option for taking a backend that someone already has and making a reactive interface on top of it. The challenge that we keep hearing from Angular developers is, well, that's great, but how do I get my data in there? And especially, how do I get real-time data or live updating data into my Angular app? And Meteor is a great story there, right? It's the rest of the platform that you need.
Yeah.
So we've been exploring what that stack would look like also.
Yeah. Well, and you also have Ben Newman. I don't know, like he was definitely working on the React stuff, or has been at least since working with you guys. And then you guys also hired the guy that wrote Vue.js, right?
Evan Yu, yeah. Both Ben and Evan are in New York, and Ben was with Facebook, Evan was with Google, and they've both brought, I think, a really good sense of the modern JavaScript ecosystem, if I can call it that, the kind of stuff that these companies are exploring, and that we think there's a way to package up in a really useful way.
Yeah. All right. So that was one big one, at least I had, that I hadn't seen in here yet. So we'll take some more of these. This one's from Neal O'Brien. I assume you say Neal. I don't know. If I butchered that, I'm sorry, man. And his question is, the community seems in flux, and oh goodness, I can't seem to click here. Something is wrong with the app. All right. So anyway, the community seems in flux at the minute with Flow Router and Flow Layout gaining some popularity. People want server-side rendering, etc. What do you think MVG can do to address this? Should they address this? I mean, if you think about it, like I'm ad-libbing on his question here. Like the URL is the most fundamental piece of the web. And by default, like Meteor doesn't really support that out of the box. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, there's a challenge that we always run into where I think Flow Router is really interesting, by the way. We've talked to Arnud about it, and we're using it ourselves in some projects. We also, Chris Mather's here, and we've worked with him on Iron Router for a long time, and even our own website is built on that. So the challenge for us is we can't do everything internally, and we shouldn't. There's some real downsides to doing that. So you want to encourage experimentation. I think it's been a real positive that Iron Router emerged, and remember that was even a couple projects that came together with Mini Pages and Tom's Router. And I think Flow Router is a really valuable perspective and another take on how to do this. So in some sense, I think the best possible outcome is to continue to experiment and to push forward on the platform, because that's how we're going to find the real innovation. It's going to come from projects like these that emerge as really good patterns for building these apps. And it's going to take, they need oxygen, and they need room to grow and fork and merge and all the other sort of evolutionary steps that happen in an open source project that's really healthy. So I view that as a plus, that there are multiple options out there. That said, I think routing's a little bit special. The biggest problem is that because it's not a core package, it's not in the documentation. So the way I look at the problem here is someone sits down to build an application in Meteor. It's a given that they're going to want a router. I think there are very few apps that don't have one. And yet we don't provide any guidance whatsoever on how that should work or what you should use. And that's really in conflict with this JavaScript application platform idea that I talked about before, right? If you think that URLs are central to an app, then you probably ought to have a story for routing, just like we have a story for data synchronization or live updating templates or the other key building blocks of the app. So I do think it's inevitable that routing is gonna come into core sooner or later. I think there's some questions here about the details, and I'm not gonna sit here and say, yeah, it's gonna be project X or project Y or exactly how or when we're gonna do that. But the way I look at anything like this, and routing's a good example, is if something emerges that feels like the right fit for the Meteor architecture, and if there's a way that we can work together with the group that's built that or bring that code into core itself. And remember, in core doesn't really mean anything technically because a package is a package. So this is really about, well, I think it's settling on a pattern and then putting it in the docs more than anything.
It's a confidence thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
For a lot of people.
We can tell people, look, this is the standard way. Again, you can use a different router if you want, right? Nobody's forcing you to use any of the core packages, and you could pull out the router just as easily as you could pull out, templating or any of the server-side packages and so forth. Server-side rendering is another example there where I think different people want different things. It's really easy to say, yeah, of course we want to render the templates on the server. And I say templates, but I actually think React offers a nice approach here that we would want to explore because of the architecture of the virtual DOM, just giving us a really straightforward way to put some HTML on the wire initially. But if you dig into that, it turns out there's different requirements from different teams. Some people are really interested in just fast SEO, and the challenge there is that relying on a whole DOM implementation on the server side, the way we do with Phantom, is really heavyweight and therefore slow. Others are interested in something a little bit more around the initial paid load time for the user. And server-side rendering can help, but a lot of things can help, right? So you might also look at optimizing the size of the Meteor application itself or ways to accelerate loading the app. So the thing I try to do with all this stuff is just dig into what's actually going on. Lord knows there's a lot we could do to add to the Meteor ecosystem and to improve these different aspects of building an application. And I think in some sense the challenge is just finding things that are mostly settled in the community where we're not too far out in front of everything and we can establish that there's now a pretty clear story for a pattern that we can move forward with. That's really the long and short of it. I would expect that we'll do something like that on routing on the sooner side just because it has emerged as a really critical piece of the pattern. And I think you'll see us doing something similar. I could talk about models or schemas or whatever, where again, we've got lots of different things in the community that have emerged, and I'm very fond of them. And I think it's starting to be clear that most developers sitting down to write most apps are going to want more explicit guidance on where do I put my models, right? What do they look like? What does a validator look like in Meteor? Rails gave us a really clear answer to that in the previous generation. Maybe not so much with the having to invent that from scratch each time. And so that's a family of things that I think we'll do more and more explicitly as we get toward 2.0.
Yeah, and so I can't remember his name, but the astronomer developer is logged in here in the chat, and he pointed out, if Iron Router would have been folded into core, would we have seen Flow Router? Would we have known about this? So that's very interesting points for sure. The other thing we're getting in the comments is, can you please put up your hood? They've noticed your custom hoodie.
It's kind of a wizard-like.
Yes, that is absolutely
the original Meteor
custom printed background.
Yeah,
I'm pretty
sure.
San
Francisco and it's cold here. It's like.
I'm pretty sure there are 230 people in this room right now that would buy one of those if you sold it. All right, so we'll move on. So this one's
let me just say that our R&D budget is probably too large to support it with clothing sales.
just swag. Yeah.
Yeah.
Here, I've got my fancy
Oh, right on,
shirt on as well. All right, so the next one's from Neil as well. MDG has been surprisingly quiet, and the roadmap has had some stuff in there for ages. We've seen Firebase offer a Galaxy-like solution. Why the quietness and perceived slowness on Meteor itself lately? And I'm gonna guess you're gonna answer Galaxy, but that would be my guess.
No, I'd say mostly this is just I haven't spent the right amount of time talking, doing things like this, and then updating things online like the roadmap on the Trello board, blog posts, and so forth, just to give a sense of where we're going. And the part of the reason for that is that Meteor 1.0 came out, Meteor 1.1 with Windows support comes out early 2015, and it's a good time to take stock of the ecosystem as a whole. So I mentioned a little bit about how quickly things have happened in JavaScript. So let me give you an example of a few things on our mind. There's a new version of the language, right? ES6 is starting to emerge as a fairly well-baked standard. And I think if you want to think about what a modern JavaScript application platform is going to look like, it's got to have a story around the modern version of the language. So ES6 brings in all kinds of questions. We've got actual classes for the first time, right? My goodness. We've got lots of developer conveniences. I'm really fond of just the more concise syntax for dictionaries of functions, for arrow functions when you just have a lambda that you want to define right in line. Block scoping of variables, wow, right? So there's a lot of these programmer conveniences that we're going to want to adopt for sure. Then there's some things like modules, right? So ES6 has an opinion. Finally, the language has an opinion on what a module ought to look like, something that we've all, as an ecosystem, struggled not having. So Meteor has some stuff that we built in the interim for that. There have been some standards that have emerged from the Node community. There have been other standards that have emerged from the client-side JavaScript community. I think now that the language has settled on something, it makes a lot of sense to think about how to align around that. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about a lot of the questions around how do we bring Meteor, the application platform, more in line with some of what's emerged from the JavaScript standards committee, the ECMAScript group. And you mentioned Ben Newman. Ben sits on the technical standards body for ECMAScript. So we've been really involved in trying to think about some of that stuff. And how do we align with some of the other things that have emerged on top of that language standard? And I think that I'd always like to be more vocal and more transparent about it. I really think it's helpful when the community pushes us to do that. And we do hear that and we do want that feedback. So I think the biggest story here is just to renew our focus on talking more about what we're up to and explaining the direction that we're headed. I think there's a role for a formal roadmap, but I also think there's a role here for just more frequent technical conversation around the day-to-day. And you're starting to see more of that on our blog. Justin wrote a post about the Kubernetes architecture for Galaxy, and I hope we have time to talk about that today. Sashko's been writing posts about some of the work we're doing on React, and you can expect to see a lot more of that over time. So I think it's a mix of both of those.
Well, I'd almost say it's the size of the team too, right? Because you guys just hired a new VP of marketing. You've got a VP of business development coming in. So you have people that can kind of like have this stuff in the forefront of their mind and making sure you guys can pay attention to it, right?
Yeah, and it's been a transition from the way I think about the company is we were an R&D shop for a long time, right? We were building crazy JavaScript stuff that was just far beyond what the JavaScript ecosystem had settled on up to this point. And we're now making the transition to, there are a lot of people building a lot of apps, and they want more guidance around the architecture of that app. The thing I hear most when I talk to people is, show me how to write the thing. Tell me where to put the files. Tell me where to put the models. Tell me how to connect this and that. I don't want this like completely flexible, can do anything architecture. We hear a lot of requests for training, right? We hear a lot of requests for support. We get a lot of interest in, how do I take an application that I've built and persuade the organization to do that with 4 or 5 more apps. So there's a bunch of this stuff that's all happening around the idea of building the ecosystem up, and none of that means that we should go and not be transparent about where the platform is headed. So I hear you loud and clear on that one. It's just one of a bunch of things that people are asking for at the same time.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So we'll call that one done. The next one is kind of pertains to Mongo, and I'm sure you knew this one was coming as well. There's been a lot of negative coverage, even still recently, about Mongo having trouble with data consistency and that kind of stuff. There was an article a couple weeks back that hit Hacker News, I think. And so, the question is, there's a lot of different, this is from Lauren, by the way, Lauren Ramshaw, Sands Ramshaw.
Yeah, I've got it on my screen now.
And he's just talking about like reactive join. There's a bunch of third-party packages. And I actually think I haven't dove deep into the code, but I actually think like there would be performance issues in the one I'm using in an app I'm building. So the question is, like, if you need normalized data, would your suggestion be to migrate to a SQL-based solution? And if so, like what would that be?
Yeah, there's a bunch here that's tied together.
Sure.
So, we're committed to database independence. We've always said that. The architecture is built that way. It's why we invested so heavily in DDP and a wire protocol that isn't tied to the Mongo database or to the Mongo schema. So I think, like any application platform, different apps want different database technologies behind them, and there are trade-offs that any developer should be making when they make that selection. So that's one thing. And we've talked some about our plans around SQL. That's a high priority for me. We've been hiring to help us build that faster. And the model I have in my head is, if you want to build your app with a relational database engine behind it, you should be able to do that. If you want to build your app with a JSON document-oriented database behind it, you should be able to do that. And the position of Mongo and Meteor is, I think, we picked it because it's a good fit, but you should think of it as the first one we picked, not the only one we picked. Right. So I think Mongo itself is going through a really interesting transition. The new Mongo 3.0 is built on a very different architecture from previous versions of Mongo, and there's some good material on their website about a technology called WireTiger that they acquired and have folded in as an alternative storage engine, effectively. And people who come from the MySQL world will remember that MySQL went through a similar transition at one point, where it went from a storage engine that was very fast but had some questionable guarantees around data integrity, to an engine in InnoDB that was very much along the lines of a traditional SQL engine with the ACID properties that you would expect. So I'm very excited. We have some developers that are using the WireTiger engine in Mongo. They've reported very good results with respect to performance. They've reported good results with respect to stability. I think in the future that is a very interesting direction, and we're committed to making sure that that works well. So in Meteor 1.1, we support WireTiger as a backend if you want to use that. MongoDB hasn't made that the default engine yet, and so we haven't either. in the Meteor SDK, but it's an option, and I think it's a good one for a lot of people that are interested in questions around atomicity or data integrity when they use Mongo.
Yeah.
The other thing here is around joins and a pattern for reactive publishing. I think that's exactly like what we talked about earlier with routing and with models and so forth, right? It's a common application pattern. We've seen some experimentation in the community. It's probably at a point where something ought to be in core that puts a stamp of approval on a pattern that we think is the best one for being able to take two different collections in a Mongo database and publish either documents from both, depending on a foreign key, or some sort of composite document that pulls together information from two different collections. We see it a lot. It's obviously high on people's minds, and I think there's a family of things like that all go under the banner of giving people a more standard default application architecture that we'd very much like to see in a future version of Meteor Core.
Yeah. I mean, so the other interesting thing is I think if we had like tracker auto run on the server, we could actually probably build a lot of this ourselves as well. So like during my mastering Meteor class, we take probably like 30 to 40 minutes to go over how to do, like in a publication, you can return more than one cursor. And so we walk through like how to create that Twitter view where you're publishing users and tweets through one publication. But then like we're grabbing follower IDs. And if that code would rerun, on the live query side, whenever those follower IDs changed.
So I think the standard has to be something more like what you get from Rails or even the Hibernate, right? It's, in Rails, there's one option to pass to a find. It's an include. It makes sense, and you get back. The mechanics behind that are really complicated, and they've changed, right? Rails used to do eager loading using left outer join. That changed at some point to be based on a series of queries to the database, but not an n number of queries, just a query against one table and then a query against a second table.
Right.
And that is not, in my opinion, the mechanics that an application developer ought to be spending their time thinking about. That's
agreed.
It's hard to write correctly, hard to write in a performant way. And so I do think that that's best put in the data layer. The situation isn't quite the same in Meteor, especially against Mongo, as it is with Rails, but a lot of the same ideas apply. Again, the test for me is, should this be in the documentation? I think the answer is clearly yes. Been on our wish list for quite a while, and at the end of the day, most of these queries look pretty similar in terms of what you're trying to do, exactly like the example you gave.
Yeah.
The challenge, and just to dig into the auto run thing, the challenge with auto run on the server is I think in some sense that's the wrong direction, because that puts the burden of thinking about reactivity back on the developer in a place where it's not as helpful. So I think auto runs can be really useful in certain places. On the client, not always. They're a very sharp knife, right? So you want to use them carefully, but what I found is that the places people most often think about using them on the server, it is very easy to inadvertently write incredibly inefficient code. And because the circumstances are more constrained on the server, in other words, they're almost always used, or you almost always want to use them in some sense for a join of this form or for a repeating task when something changes. The primitives around observable queries, and I think around a higher level built-in version of some kind of join, end up being a better direction to go, just because they bake in more of the high performance implementation that we can do once and do well, and then support for everyone.
Cool. All right. So I think we kind of covered the SQL question, and so there's another one here. The next top one is about Tabris.js, which I think is along the same lines as React, or I don't know, maybe the interesting question is, if we get React, do you think we'll see React Native follow closely behind, or how easy do you think it is to maybe switch out Cordova? I don't know. Either of those questions would be fun to answer.
React Native is very, very interesting for us. It's, I think the really compelling story for a JavaScript application platform is that you can write a single code base with a single team of developers that know normal stuff. And that's the basis of your app on any mobile device that you'd want to support, plus the web. That's the ball game for a lot of teams. It's incredibly expensive and difficult to build an app that feels good when you have to do that on each of all these different platforms. So for your, if you're a company, maybe your one most important app, you will have an iOS team and an Android team, or you'll have a team that spends a lot of time optimizing the JavaScript version of that using Cordova, and you're really careful about your CSS transitions and all of the different little details that have to go into a great mobile app. But for a lot of teams, it's just, it's too complicated and too difficult to make the commitment to all these different mobile platforms.
Yeah, I would agree.
React Native is we'll see, right? It's really early, but I think it's a compelling and interesting direction because there's the potential to get the best of both worlds, right? We can write our code in JavaScript, our models, our data synchronization, our business logic. We can even share some of that code between the clients that are running on the devices and the cloud, where you have to run your validators in a secure place with your real database. But you get access to the native widgets, the native UI components, and most importantly, the native performance. And so we'll see. I think it's an area that's way too early to settle on and say, yeah, the future direction is to use something like React Native, but we're keeping a really close eye on that. And I think a lot of this next couple of years with JavaScript applications in general is really going to be focused around the mobile experience. So, any work that happens on that front is, I think, super exciting to see. And we'll see. There's a chance that the Angular team could make a similar choice with Angular 2.0. Other things may emerge as well. We're excited about anything that makes it easier and better to use JavaScript on the device. And I think that the trajectory for that is a really promising one overall.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I'll just say, like, the last 6 months I've been working on a Cordova application for a client, and it's been a very fun process. There's certainly been some, I don't have any hair, but beard pulling moments, I guess, right, for me. But overall, I would say it's still been a positive experience. And my guess is, like, turning on the Android side of things would probably take us about a week. But the client only wanted iOS out of the gate. So it's definitely been interesting.
And we're going to see that pattern again and again in JavaScript, right? There's things that are possible, but they're challenging.
Yeah.
Meteor can make those things a little bit easier, more accessible. I want a world where a client doesn't say, I only want it for iOS. Nobody only wants it for iOS, right? I guess Apple, right? But most people want their apps on all the devices.
Well, so it is an enterprise, and I think that they have, like, they've invested in the Apple enterprise architecture. So,
but there's so many, bring your own device now is driving so much of this stuff, and it's getting harder and harder to exclude any of the big mobile platforms. It's I think almost always done out of a concern around budget or time to market, right? And that's where JavaScript can completely change the equation. I think that's where Meteor has the most to offer for the mobile developer. It's a opportunity to reach everyone on day one and with a really great application experience.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say, I mean, there's great examples of that. Like having, I go to church at Crossroads Church, and Differential did a blog post about scaling to 20,000 users in the course of a weekend, and that post was about a Cordova app that they built with Meteor, and it scaled out to web browser, Android, and iOS. So, I mean,
Right.
you know, they provided a pretty seamless experience across all those platforms, which is pretty awesome, honestly, in a 12-week time period. So, kudos to them. All right, so we've got a couple more questions. While we're on Cordova, I'm gonna cherry pick some of these out of here as well. Where did it go? There was one up towards the top I thought I saw. So I know one of them was about offline app support. Are you guys looking at that at all? Or, you know, should we be looking at GroundDB, you think? Or what are your thoughts there?
I think we're going to need to see some more research from the community on this one before something were to land in core.
Mm-hmm.
Offline is an interesting use case. It's there's a class of apps where it's incredibly valuable. It's key to the experience, but those tend to be a very particular kind of app, right? And if you think about the idea of an app that's collaborative, where multiple people are using it, if you think about an app that's live updating in the sense that you can see each other's actions at the same time, that kind of goes in a different direction. And we've seen, I think, a lot of the excitement about what's possible to write in Meteor and with JavaScript really wants always to be connected, because that's where you're working on a task with other people, or you're looking at data that other people are changing as they look at it. So I think there's a place for a clean offline data story for a very particular kind of data-driven app, like a
Telescope.
Well, I mean, what's an offline telescope? See, I don't think that's the top line requirement for Telescope, right? Are you going to post comments offline and then sync them once you're back? That's a fairly niche use case, right? I think a better example would be,
but I think
be able to read.
People want to be able to read the news, right?
Yeah, I think caching content can be really valuable, but offline support usually implies something much bigger, right? It means you're going to have multiple changes. You're going to synchronize those changes once devices come back online. It ends up being a really specific data model that I think has its place, but is not what the average application ends up wanting to be able to do.
Yeah. Okay. So I've got a couple more questions around kind of around when the next version of Meteor is going to drop, because it looks like it in the develop branch anyway. There's support for switching to Cordova 5. So what?
Yeah, we may do a release in the next few weeks. We're just looking at the timing now. There's actually a lot that's landed on Devel since the last release, so I'm eager to get that stuff out. We're mostly always just trying to balance. Releases go through a process here, because part of the value of an application platform is that all of these parts are QA'd together.
Yeah.
You mentioned Cordova. Probably the most expensive part of the QA process is the mobile QA element. So testing that, on the Android development environment, on different desktop platforms, you can make your application, testing that those applications work properly on the different mobile devices that we support. That ends up being a fair amount of work, and particularly when there is a change to the mobile tool chain, we want to be extra careful about making sure that stuff's all buttoned up nicely. So we'll see. We may push that out as its own thing, but we're also getting closer to some of the initial support for React as a view layer that I mentioned. We've also got a project running around changes to the build tool itself to support CSS preprocessors and higher performance by avoiding unnecessary recompilation or transpilation of different files. So we'll just find the right point where we can land a good piece of that at once in a release.
Yeah. So, and I'll just selfishly ask the question, like, if someone wants to get something merged into Devel, like, what's what's the best way to do that? Because I had a pull request out there that actually had tests with it, and it's just been sitting there untouched for a while. So like, how does a community member contribute to Meteor Core, I guess?
Pull requests are great. We've tried to steer all that stuff to GitHub. The first thing we've tried to do is get back to everyone as quickly as we can, and we actually have a tool built in Meteor to help us track everything that's on GitHub and make sure that we've got someone looking at it and understanding what's going on. A lot of times, what happens is there's a pull request and it doesn't cleanly drop in. It has implications around APIs, for example, or may involve changes to a module that someone's just going to want to have a chance to think more about. And I think a place we need to keep working on is helping give people a sense of what we're thinking about and how best to fold that in, or what changes may need to be made before we could fold it in. And I think a lot of that, frankly, is just about building the team. Meteor is not a small platform. There's a lot in there, a lot of different cross-cutting concerns. So a change to templating could have an implication for Blaze or for live data or lots of other parts of the stack, right? And I think it's a surprise to a lot of people who are submitting pull requests from the community how much has to go in to thinking through the implications of each of those changes and then pulling that stuff into core. So we want to get better about a couple things. One of them is being faster and more responsive on that stuff. We always do. There's never a point where that's good enough. And I think the biggest thing there is just having more time and more people on the team that can do that.
Yeah.
And the other is finding ways to expose more of the way we think about that stuff so that people can have an intuition for why something ends up being a little bit more involved than is obvious at first glance. So we're trying to write more and just be more vocal about that. And I think also on my side, I can do more to point people in different directions with respect to the roadmap and say, look, here's an area like offline support where we really welcome experimentation. We're not saying we're going to merge every PR that comes in.
Right.
I don't think any project does, but a place where that kind of innovation would be really cool. Maybe there's other places where we have very specific things that, this is the way it should work. And we'd love to invite people to help contribute implementations of that. And maybe there's areas where we say, look, this is about to change in a significant way. And frankly, we don't recommend a lot of attention here because it's going to be hard for us to merge suggestions if we're about to completely rototill a particular package or go in a different direction with something.
Okay. Makes sense. So yeah, we'll call that one done as well. Well, I can't call it done. That was my question. Let's see. So we got about 11 minutes left. So I did want to touch on Galaxy stuff here. So that's probably what we'll focus the rest of the time on. The very first one is, when will Galaxy be ready for production quality Meteor applications? And is Galaxy the only business model for MDG? So
we're working hard on it. I'm not going to give a date. I think we want to make sure things are in really great shape. And, especially when we talk about running production apps in the cloud, that's a high standard. That's got to be rock solid. That's got to be something that, you've put a lot of effort into building the app. It's got to run smoothly and correctly. Our strategy for that is to build on top of the best stuff that's out there. So if you haven't read it, Justin Santa Barbara wrote a post on the blog a couple weeks ago about the architecture of Galaxy and why we chose Kubernetes as the core piece of open source technology behind that. And I won't go over the whole thing, but the short version is, I don't think there's anybody in the world more knowledgeable about how to build reliable distributed systems than the team at Google. And they have been baking the very best practices and the best architectures into Kubernetes. We've been working very closely with them on that because we've been maintaining the parts of Kubernetes that support AWS, which is where most people want to run their apps today, right? So that's all evolving. Kubernetes just recently hit code freeze around 1.0 features, and Google and partners like us are working really hard to get that into really great shape. So I think the first question around when is it ready for stable production use, a lot of that comes down to how quickly we can land a stable version of Kubernetes. And that is moving very, very quickly. We're really excited about the pace of that and the direction that that's going. And I think that we're in really good shape on that front, actually. And it's just a great foundation to be able to build on because it's open source. It's something that everybody can look inside of and trust and understand. And again, is based on like the way that probably the very best people in the world and the teams that have had the most at stake around building these big distributed systems have worked on. What was the other question?
Is this the only business model that you guys have in front of you?
The only business model.
The only way to make money.
We've said for a long time that we want to ship a service called Galaxy that will let you run your apps at scale, and that's how the company will make money. So what I'd say is, look, there is a lot of interest in having a reliable way to run these apps, and I think a lot of larger organizations are excited to purchase that as a commercial service. And the reason is because when you run your app in production, there's a lot at stake, right? And downtime can be really expensive. Everybody knows this story, right? So the stakes can be very high. If it's an app that's critical to your company, maybe it's something customers use, maybe it's an internal process that you've got running, it's really important that that stuff work really well. So the way I think about this is Galaxy is a good place to start because it's a service that we can run based on the best possible architecture designed around the needs of a modern Meteor app. And then there's a lot of stuff that can sit around that. So we talked really early, I think, about people asking for help with their app, and help can come in a lot of different forms. But I think it's important that if you sit down to make a commitment to building an app in Meteor, we ought to be able to help you with all of the pieces of that story. So we ought to be able to help you run the application at scale. We ought to be able to help you make sure that it's written in the right way. We ought to be able to help train potentially the people that are going to write that app and give them the best practices around the architecture for that stuff. So I think you'll see a lot of stuff on that front, but definitely the anchor of all of this is a really strong story for a modern cloud environment for running that app. And that's what Galaxy is, the long and short of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting to me to watch happen too, because, you mentioned earlier, you guys started as an R&D shop. And so going from, an R&D shop to hosting and support platform, that's a pretty big transition in my brain anyway. I don't know if that's true. A lot of hiring and whatnot. But have you guys talked about SLAs and support and the paid offerings that you'll have there at all?
I think different people want different things. It's, and we can look at the way that I look at the Java ecosystem as a good map for how this stuff works, because it's such a rich history of how to take applications that were built using a platform, in that case Java, and in different settings with customers that have different needs, making sure that they have everything they need to be able to run that app in their organization. So yeah, look, some people want 24/7, 365. I want to call you at any time and make sure that any problems I run into are addressed right away. And that's something we're going to be able to offer people at some point. Others are going to want, look, I wrote my app. I'm a JavaScript developer. I am not, first of all, I'm not controlling an Apollo launch here, right? It's the stakes are different. And I want to know that my app's running well. I want it to run the right way. I want it to run in the right place. And I don't want to have to sweat the details, right? So just a really, give me a good story for what do I have to do to make sure I'm doing everything the right way. And I think of that as sort of a continuum of the same questions we help answer when you're writing your app. So just like we point you at packages that are in core because they're the best way to build an app, and we'll add to that list with things like routing and so forth. When it comes time to run that app in the cloud, it shouldn't be a bunch of complicated decisions, right? It should be it should be the right decision, and it should be reliable enough that you don't have to think about it too much, right? There are better things to spend your time on than wondering if your application processes are healthy. And I think there's a lot we can do here because we can make changes in the Meteor open source core that align with the capabilities of a cloud hosting platform to make this stuff work really smoothly. It shouldn't be a big mystery to figure out if your app needs more horsepower behind it because the load's going up, or if one of the machines fails, and so we have to reconnect all of the active clients to some other copy of the application. We want to do that in a really smooth way. Those are exciting to people like us, but I think for a lot of developers, it's like, I just want the thing to work well, right? So a lot of that stuff we want to put into Galaxy in a way that anybody can take advantage of it without being an expert in these questions and without having to learn a whole new set of technologies just to be able to run an app effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. That's definitely seems to be like a main client concern is, are there scaling experts, or like, how am I going to get this done? That kind of thing. So.
Yeah, and look, this stuff doesn't have to be so hard. I think if you look at a lot of developer technologies in history, they're just uselessly complicated. And we've always set out to make things accessible and easy. And I don't mean that they're dumb and simple and stupid. I just mean there's no excuse for a platform that's hard to use when we have the technology in front of us to make it easy to use. There's no excuse for hosting that requires you learn all the intricacies of WebSockets when we have the technology to make that stuff really, really simple and easy to get started with. And I think there's an art to doing it in a way where if you do have the sophisticated understanding of how it works on the inside, if you, for example, know what Kubernetes looks like, you ought to be able to take advantage of that. So you ought to be able to observe how the system's working. You ought to be able to swap out different elements of a system with either a custom component that you wrote or just a different direction. But those should be choices that are optional, not required. And the starting point should be really, really simple and straightforward. And that's the experience we've always strived to give developers on the Meteor side. And it's the experience we're carrying over to the question of how do you run that application once you've written it and you're excited to get it on the net and have people use it.
Yeah. So I'm going to skip the top voted question because I think scaling, like we've talked about it a little bit, but it's individual to each app, right? Like I can build an app that could probably scale to 10 million users and 40,000, or 10 million users and 40,000 concurrent. That's a thing that can be done, but it's going to be different for each app. So I don't know that it's worth us talking a ton about.
Yeah, my comment on that is one of the things that JavaScript's so new and JavaScript apps are so new. One of the things that isn't as established as it is in the old generation of web technologies is a good story around benchmarking. And something that we're excited to work on is how do we answer that question, right? How do we prove that you've built an app? I want to load test it. Well, what does that look like? And there's a lot of stuff in the community around that, but there isn't, in my mind, a really clear standard benchmark for the performance of a live updating or a cloud client app like what you build with Meteor. And we're gonna make some progress on that.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. All right. So maybe we have time for two more. Do you have a hard stop or?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So in one sentence, David Sikora wants to know what feature are you most excited about that you think will land in Meteor this year?
ES6.
ES6. There we go. That's awesome. I am also equally excited about that.
It's a great language. And we'll do some work to talk about each of these things that we're so excited about in it. But if you want to talk about how to architect your app in a clean, standard way, there's so much here around block scoping, around classes, around modules, that we just think really makes JavaScript a great choice for application development. And we're excited about each of those things, and we're going to make it really, really easy to use in a Meteor setting.
Awesome. I'm excited. All right. So last question. And I will say I got into a heavily heated debate last night about this one. And so this is from Nathan Castilla. I hope I said that right. Sorry, I butcher names all the time. What's your take on paid Meteor packages? Will that impact the chemistry inside the Meteor community? I'm looking at WordPress and Drupal communities, and I feel like one effect that paid plugins had on WordPress was changing the focus from the community as a whole to the developer as an individual. Do you think this is a good or bad thing?
I don't know if we have that kind of time. I mean, I think people should make money when they write software. It's not a bad thing for a package author, and we've seen some examples of this in the Meteor community, right? Mm-hmm. It's not a bad thing for a package author to write something great that people want to use and make a living on that. And something we've always set out to do is create an ecosystem where things like that are possible and, frankly, encouraged. But I think the question gets at a really interesting point, which is community. We've focused on this since the very first day. We've always thought that a strong, healthy community is essential to the success of any of this stuff. And we're all in this together. Like it's not just open source in the sense that code comes from a lot of people. It's also a community in the sense of teaching each other how to write software. We've invested in DevShop as a way to share stories and help people see the kinds of things you can build and how to think about using Meteor to accomplish some goal, right? Whether it's building an app for a company or whether it's building something for a community of your own. And everything we do has to support that. So I think it's going to be a really exciting challenge to help the community evolve in a way that allows more and more of this commercial ecosystem to emerge, whether that's consulting shops or packages that you purchase or plugins to Galaxy or all these other things that could happen. Yeah. Well, also, I think there's something really, really special about the Meteor community. And it's not lost on any of us. And we're really excited to help continue to press that forward and to make sure that it's a really welcoming place for anybody who wants to collaborate and share ideas and be open and welcomed and rewarded for doing that inside the community too.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I agree with your sentiment, right? Like, it's very hard to be an open source package maintainer where you get a lot of requests coming in from people. And, you get the angry shakes fist, like, this broke my app, you should fix it. And, here you are, like, giving your time. And, it can be a very frustrating problem to deal with. And I see no problem in asking for some dollars up front to help kind of offset your time involvement in something like that. And especially if you give a good experience, in my opinion.
The other thing I'd love to do is, we're in the same boat, right? Meteor is an open source company, and we need to make money. A package author that wrote an open source software package wants to make money, right? There's a lot we can share about what we've learned. Mm-hmm. And, I don't know what form that comes in. And obviously this is waving my hands a bit, but I'd love to get to a place where a lot of what we know and a lot of what we've learned is something that we can share and give back to the community as a whole and help, with everything from, like, how do I price this to what does it look like to package it up to just turns out there's some really interesting new ideas around open source and business models that I'd love to have just be a part of the Meteor ecosystem as a whole and have everyone learn from that and use that.
Yeah, agreed. All right. Well, I don't want to run over too much here. First, I want to say thank you very much for coming on the show. It was awesome having you on here, and everyone saying thanks for your taking the time out to do this. Everyone seems like they enjoyed it. So.
Yeah, happy to.
Yeah, awesome. All right, guys. Well, I don't know if I can top this one. This was definitely like a lot of people watching and commenting and way more questions. Usually we'll have a couple left over. But next month we'll definitely find someone interesting to talk to and hopefully keep talking about all your Meteor questions. So thanks again, and tune in next month.